Hello and welcome to live programming here at the More Freedom Foundation. Today I want to talk about the growing conflict in Sudan. I think this is something that everybody should be paying more attention to and being a little more worried about. I am typically on this channel not somebody who goes for the panic and trying to scare folks or whatnot. But I'm finding as I look more and more into this conflict in Sudan, and I think more and more about the ramifications, I am getting more and more worried. You may have noticed this trajectory in the YouTube shorts I've been putting up over the past couple days. In 2011, the United States destroyed Libya, a country of 5 million people. And the after effects of that have been incredibly ruinous for the entire north half of the African continent. The Sahel, sort of the southern coast of the Sahara, if you will, has been an expanding disaster. Anybody who's sort of paid attention to what's going on in Mali, in Niger, in Nigeria, of course, the Central African Republic, Chad, will have noticed that the past decade, tragically, after a first decade of the century that was actually pretty good, the past decade has been a catastrophe. That was the result of the destruction of a country of 5 million people. 5 to 10, I'm sorry. Don't have the exact figures on Libyan population at this point, but I believe it's between 5 and 10 million people. Sudan has 45 million people. And I think it's early to say this. We've only got about 3 or 4 days of conflict now, but I think it's possible that we are seeing the beginning of a Sudanese civil war. And if that is what is happening, I think that the implications are enormous. So that's what we'll be talking about today for the next 45 minutes or so. Then we'll go into Q&A for the second half of this presentation. I'll aim to do this for about 2 hours. Before we get into this, some preliminaries. Can you let me know in the comments, am I coming through okay? Are we getting the sound and visuals going through all right? If you could let me know in the chat. For those of you who may be new here, you may notice that there is a chat that you are encouraged to engage in throughout the course of this presentation. However, I don't have the bandwidth to follow the chat and also deliver this presentation on the Sudanese war that I have prepared. So I do have a moderator. That is Logo Cool Extreme. You are encouraged to say anything you want about me, my ideas, my appearance, what have you. Be as insulting as you want. We also have a pretty free range of ideas expressed here. As long as it's not overtly genocidal, we'll let you talk about it. We do have some pretty hard and fast rules, however. You're not allowed to be disruptive of the chat. Don't just cut and paste sort of spam. And you're also not allowed to be abusive of anybody else in the chat. No going after each other in discriminatory ways or what have you. As I said, you can talk all you want about how soulless I am because of my red hair or my ugly beard or what have you. But if you go against other people in the chat, you will be warned by Logo Cool Extreme. And if you don't listen to Logo Cool Extreme, he will ban you. There is no appeal from the court of Loga. So pay attention to what he tells you in the chat. If you want to generously contribute super chats and what have you, I'm always a big fan of that. I would ask that you maybe hold off until the Q&A so I can deal with your questions then. Okay, with all that said, let's talk about Sudan. I guess the best way to get into this would be to give you the quick, easy history, and then we'll go in a little more depth, because Sudan is, despite the fact that I haven't covered it to the extent that I would like, it is a country that I have spent a fair amount of time researching. I've read 3 or 4 books and have followed it quite fairly closely over the past 4 years. Actually, first, let's look at the geography. So Sudan is to the south of Egypt. The nightmare scenario that people have been focused on in Europe and the United States from a refugee standpoint is the idea that Egypt, the country to the north of Sudan, could fall apart. Egypt has 100 million people on the Nile. And if that were to fall apart, the ramifications for the region, for Africa as well, for the Middle East, for MENA, that sort of Middle East, North Africa region, for Africa entirely, for Europe, really for the world would be extreme. And for that reason, Egypt's dictator over the past, now full decade, Sisi, has been given a lot of leeway. He's been given a lot of free funding from the United States, from the IMF, from the Gulf countries. There are other reasons, of course, why Egypt is so heavily funded. But it's a scenario that people were really worried about, this prospect that Egypt would potentially fall apart. And if that were to happen, the ramifications would be nightmarish. I don't think people have put enough thought into what happens if Sudan falls apart. And I think there's a distinct chance that what we are seeing right now is Sudan actually falling apart. This is particularly sad, this is particularly tragic because we had a positive image, or at least the positive potential for Sudan over the past 4 years. Sudan was ruled for 30 years by Omar al-Bashir, a truly nightmarish dictator, fairly open enemy of the United States and a variety of other folks. Just a mess. Credibly accused of genocide. You may recall, if you're in your 30s or late 20s or older, you may recall the controversy over Darfur that was openly acknowledged to be a genocide ongoing in the first decade of this century. And Bashir, that is only one of the many crimes that he was guilty of. In 2019, he lost power. He fell out of power. We'll go into the roots of why that happened in a little more detail in some time. But what you need to know is that in the spring of 2019, he fell out of power and left power to, it seems, more or less two guys. We've got Burhan and we've got Hemeti. Burhan is the guy in green, the somewhat older gentleman, and Hemeti is the guy in the foreground. These are the folks who took over in the aftermath of Omar al-Bashir. They were meant to be taking over in partnership with a civilian government. There was a civilian government. It's funny, I've heard very little of Abdallah Hamdok over the recent days. He is no longer the prime minister after jumping in and out of power in somewhat power as the civilian component of the Sudanese government post-2019. What happened was Omar Bashir kicked out in April. These guys take control. And the streets of Khartoum essentially refused to let the old dictatorship transfer into a new dictatorship. And because of the heroism of these protesters on the streets of Khartoum, by June or July, I believe, of 2019, a formal transition process was set up whereby Burhan and Hemeti agreed that they would transfer power to a civilian government by the fall of 2021. So, of course, in the fall of 2021, these guys working together, they're fighting this past week, but they were working together throughout the 2019 to 2021 period. These guys decided to do a coup in October of 2021, turfed out Hamdok, the civilian, was he prime minister, I believe, the civilian guy, then sort of invited him back after outside pressure, back and forth, this and that, what have you. And I think another sort of transition process was supposed to come to fruition and hand power over the civilians this spring. I apologize for the siren in the background. That was supposed to happen this spring, summer, and now we've got outright open civil war between these guys, Burhan and Hemeti. These are, of course, the fruits of the Omar al-Bashir dictatorship. This is a dynamic that we see. So why are there two military forces? You've got Burhan, the guy in green, is in charge of the more official Sudanese armed forces, or is it Sudanese Arab Force? I don't know, whatever. Sudanese SAF is the acronym. And then you've got Hemeti. Dagalo is his last name. Hemeti is his common nickname. is in charge of the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF. So why does Sudan have two military forces? This is a very standard thing that dictators like to do. This goes back to Bashir, so as to reduce the risk of the military coming after him, he created two military forces. So though that was the case in 2019 when Bashir fell, and it became clear that with Bashir gone, you couldn't have one guy in charge of both of these military forces. You have the both of them. So they ruled in uneasy partnership with a civilian transition that over the past 4 years they've made a mockery of and largely just booted out entirely. Over the past couple months, the development that I think directly precipitated this was that the RSF was meant to be incorporated into the official military forces. That's something that absolutely should have happened. Countries should not have two military forces. And Hemeti and his other folks in the RSF decided that they would not like this to happen. And now we've got what looks to me like the beginnings of a particularly horrific civil war. Let's go back to this map and talk about why this is potentially so damaging. So you've got Libya on the map there, very big country geographically, but also it's really just 5 million people or so. The 2011 crushing of Libya led to a whole bunch of militias shooting into the Sahel region generally. You've got Mali, Niger, Chad, Burkina Faso, Central African Republic, Nigeria were all heavily destabilized by the implosion of this country of just 5 million people. Sudan was not as heavily impacted by the implosion of Libya because Sudan was already in a state of more or less open war, has been, honestly, for decades. That has to do with Sudan's long-standing war against South Sudan. South Sudan only became independent, I believe, in 2013 or 2014 or thereabouts. But for decades before that, going back to the 1960s, Sudan and South Sudan had an ongoing fight. Let's look at the more detailed map here. Now, if you just look at the countries that are bordering on Sudan, this is sort of a more in detail map of Sudan and these countries here. Almost every country here is in a tremendously fragile state. Ethiopia, longtime viewers know, just finished a 2-year horrific war. Specifically, that war, Tigray, is centered on an area that's very close to the border with Sudan. That's probably Western Tigray that the Tigrayans no longer have control of. But Sudan falling apart definitely makes it harder to maintain peace in that conflict in Ethiopia. South Sudan became independent in 2013, and I think by 2014 had fallen into one of the most horrific civil wars of the century thus far. So, I guess probably the only other competitor is the Ethiopian civil war that ended 2 years ago. Central African Republic is currently under, this is another very, very small country. South Sudan is, I think it's over 10 million. Ethiopia is over 100 million. Central African Republic is only about 4 or 5 million. Chad and Libya, these are all rather small countries, but they're also actively destabilized countries. The Central African Republic is, because it is so small and because Russia has committed so many resources to it, seems to be in a brief moment of what looks like peace, but I don't think anybody really expects that to last. Chad, its president was killed in open warfare within the past 3 years. Can't remember when that was exactly, so they've obviously got some problems. Libya, the civil war is not in its most active phase, but it is not being settled. Eritrea is famous as Africa's North Korea, which is run by Isaias Afwerki. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that appropriately, the strongman who has been running the place, and in some people's description is sort of this I think people just actually describe him as the spider, this just sort of manipulative, sinister force behind the scenes of a lot of terrible things that happen in the region. So if you've got Sudan falling apart, you have the potential of triggering larger conflict everywhere in Africa. And to be clear, this is not a neighborhood that has been going well. And I think that people might say, "Oh well, nothing new. This is we've dealt with destabilized Sahel for the past decade. How could this possibly be different?" This could be different in a lot of ways. Sudan has more or less kept together under some degree of unified control over the past 30, 40 years. It has fought massive wars, not just against South Sudan that became independent, but also in, I think, 2003, 2005 or thereabouts, a massive Darfur war crushing an insurgency in Darfur. But that Sudan has largely been together. It has been a very wealthy petrostate, and it's been a very wealthy petrostate that has spent the past half century fighting and crushing and eventually losing to insurgencies. So if this country, with all of these weapons, falls apart, with all of these weapons and crucially with all of these militias, all of these armed folks who are used to making their living through violence, falls apart, if they lose their patrons in the Sudanese state, then the overflow throughout this entire region becomes quite terrifying. With all due respect to Mali and Niger and Chad, it's terribly sad to see those places destabilized. Seeing Sudan destabilized is a whole nother animal. And that is, I think, what we are seeing right now. And I think that is frankly terrifying. Like, this is the Egyptian nightmare. This is the catastrophic scenario from a refugee standpoint and from a stability of Northern Africa standpoint. Now, nothing about this is inevitable. What is so irritating about this is, as I mentioned in a short earlier, is that in most civil wars, you can, if you think about it hard enough, you can see both sides' arguments. You can see why these folks might consider taking up arms. And, well, obviously, certainly for me, I always think that a war is a mistake. I can at least put myself in a mental space for the purposes of analysis where I can sort of vaguely understand why they might be doing this. In Sudan, it's just two worthless strongmen defending their fiefs. So there's nothing to sympathize with here. There's nothing redeeming here, and it's not necessary. If these men had not been so endorsed by regional actors like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, or what have you, it's entirely possible that, sort of interestingly, I don't see the United States as uniquely at fault here the way we were in Libya. I think this was more on local regional actors and, of course, the Sudanese themselves. It's just a terrible, terrible tragedy, and it is the battle of these strongmen that seems like it could rip the continent apart. So I think that there needs to be much more seriousness about this conflict. I think that the United States government needs to be putting more effort into this, approaching this more seriously. Unfortunately, despite both sides being equally contemptible, I think it's pretty clear that for the sustainability and peace and safety of the world, it's pretty clear that we should pick Burhan. We want Burhan to win. Hemeti is quite horrific. I think there was an analogy that I used that is obviously inappropriate, but if you look at these two men. Burhan is Putin, except much less legitimate than Putin. He is the guy, the dictator in charge of official military forces, the government more or less. Again, significantly less legitimate than Putin, but he at least has some status quo elements or what have you. Hemeti, the head of the Rapid Support Forces, is basically Prigozhin. He's basically Wagner. I think that a lot of people are getting very excited about Hemeti's relationship to the Wagner forces. I think there's a sort of pathology in U.S. media to say, oh, this is all about Russia. This is all about Russian manipulativeness, but actually, like, what Hemeti is not some kind of Russian plant or plot. He is a colleague, really. He's in the same business. He is a transnational warlord, like Prigozhin. So while it's obvious there's nothing good about Burhan, the less legitimate Putin, he is much, much better than Sudan that would be run by Hemeti, who is this guy who is a international warlord. The Rapid Support Forces, Hemeti's forces, are less so now, but in the early years of the Saudi Arabian invasion of Yemen, those were the main soldiers for Saudi Arabia. That's Sudan. Hemeti has played a really negative role, and the Rapid Support Forces have played a really negative role in the persistence of the Libyan civil war. His forces have been working with Haftar, a guy in Libya I've complained a lot about on this channel. He's a really, really, really bad actor. He's absurdly wealthy, I think because of gold resources that have been found over the past decade, and he is a really bad actor. And the chances of the Sudanese state being entirely controlled by Hemeti are really, really disturbing. That's a very disturbing possibility. He is not the person we should want to win. The RSF specifically comes out of Omar al-Bashir developed that out of the Janjaweed militias, which were the actual instruments of genocide in Darfur, in Sudan, in the early years of this century. That is where Hemeti came up as a Janjaweed militia leader. He is obviously an incredibly talented, incredibly Machiavellian figure who has risen up from very little to being not just a national power in Sudan, but an international power. I read something that was very on point and interesting yesterday, just pointing out that both Burhan and Hemeti, Hemeti is the nickname of Mohammed Hamda Dagalo. Hemeti and Burhan both have their own foreign policies. I think Burhan as well, to a lesser extent, was involved in Yemen. So this guy has risen up from nothing. He's actually very, presumably, I don't know if I assume it's not Hemeti himself, but he has a very competent Twitter presence in not just in flawless English, but also in the language of human rights. Hemeti, hopefully this is a sign that Hemeti and the RSF are not doing well, but he is now calling for outside intervention against the horrifically anti-democratic Burhan. I mean, this is a guy who he's learned the lingo, a very talented Machiavellian, terrifying figure that we should not want to see running the state of Sudan. So there's no moral difference or benefit, I would say, between Burhan or Hemeti, but I think for the sake of stability and safety of the continent and the world, I think it would be better if Burhan were to win. Obviously, neither of these men should be in power. There should be a democratic transition, but at this point, I don't think we should let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Would be for the better for the official Sudanese armed forces to win this conflict rather than the genocidal Janjaweed successors, the RSF. Unfortunately, the chances of neither of them winning are probably the more likely thing. I think commentators like Alex DeWall, a guy who's got a very convincing picture of how conflict works, sort of in the Horn of Africa and a little bit beyond. I don't think Sudan's quite in the Horn. You have to be suspicious of that. Some white British guy who's got a really compelling vision of how things work. But I have found in my experience that his description of how these things work and go tends to be, if not prophetic, tends to be rather on point. And I think he has emphasized that if this continues, I think we're in this early point where there's a distinct possibility that Hemeti and Burhan can retain control of their forces and be forced to the negotiating table. If they are not forced to the negotiating table over the next week or so, what we're going to see is separate deals get cut between these figures and their subsidiaries and their other militias. The conflict can start taking on more of an ethnic flavor or a clannish flavor, and then it just becomes a full-blown civil war that nobody can ever deal with. I talked in my short this morning about, is this something that could be worse than the conflict in Ethiopia, which may be surprising. The conflict in Ethiopia between 2020 and 2022, considered, we don't have good numbers, but the chances are it's probably a competition between the South Sudan Civil War of 2014 to 2020 or thereabouts. I don't know the exact dates. It's entirely possible that the Ethiopian Civil War beat out the South Sudanese Civil War for the most lethal conflict of this century. We don't know. But the thing about the Ethiopian Civil War is that was a war of consolidation. That was Abiy Ahmed, the president of Ethiopia. I can never remember which one. I have a very long video unpacking that conflict from a couple of years back. But Abiy Ahmed was consolidating his power by taking out or reducing the power of the Tigrayans who had ruled the country before Abiy Ahmed. So that was consolidating. As horrific as that war was, that was a war that consolidated a nation state. This war in Sudan strikes me as likely to be dismantling a nation state. And if this conflict is allowed to continue, if we don't get Burhan and Hemeti at the table and coming up with some kind of new dispensation very quickly, we could get a sort of endemic, ongoing conflict. And again, this is in a country that is heavily, heavily armed, not just with AK-47s and whatnot, but fighter jets and artillery. And what's happening in Khartoum right now, this is the capital of Sudan, is what the capital of Sudan did to Darfur less than the last decade. We're seeing open, horrific war with bombing, and I think it's actually Burhan that's probably doing more of the bombing of the RSF forces in Khartoum. So, I mean, it is a really, really dark thing that is developing, and the problem here is that it could persist and spread everywhere else. I think we should talk a little bit about the broader tragedy of this, because Sudan is not. Sudan had popular elections. I don't know how free and fair they were, but had popular elections that decided who would have power as recently as the 1980s. This is a country that was fairly consolidated on a number of levels. And I think what we're seeing here is just an extraordinary illustration, as if we needed another one, of the resource curse. Sudan became a petrostate, became a large-scale exporter of oil and gas in 1979, and it had its last worthwhile election in the late 1980s. I think those two facts are very connected. large-scale petroleum interests allowed the central government under Omar al-Bashir to consolidate itself. My understanding is that for the first decade of Bashir's dictatorship, he had to work a little more closely with an Islamist party. They had to cooperate. Bashir had to engage in the give and take of national politics a little bit more. But by the 90s, but by the end of the 90s, he had become wealthy enough from the oil and gas extraction. I think primarily oil extraction in Sudan's case, but don't quote me on that. He'd become wealthy enough that he could dispense with any facade of democracy and went just full on whole hog dictatorship. And again, just stepping back again, like just the incredible tragedy of this. I think Caspian Report did a video a year or so back, just talking about the incredible agricultural bounty of Sudan. It has this potential to be the breadbasket for the region. Arab states, I think even China, have been interested in buying up land and securing essentially options on the agricultural bounty that Sudan could provide. It was a part of the British Empire, and I was lucky enough to be sort of a neglected part of the British Empire, in that the British just they didn't really want to be there. It's only because of the conjunction of a couple religious fanatics that they ended up having to be there. A British religious fanatic named Gordon and a Sudanese religious fanatic named the Mahdi, who killed Gordon, and then the British decided it was something to do with. To be clear, Gordon got killed by going against his orders to get the heck out of Sudan because Britain didn't care about it. So Gordon gets killed by the Mahdi, and then it becomes a national honor thing for the British, so they have to go in and defeat the Mahdi, which they do at extraordinary expense in the late 1890s. I think it was in the 1890s, late 1890s, yeah, 1890 something or other. Anyway, absolutely crush the Mahdi and the Mahdi's forces. Establish British control of the Sudan, and are like, well, gee whiz, what are we going to do with this big chunk of land in the middle of Africa? And they do very little. I think that ends up leaving Sudan as a place where not a ton of history happens. They actually, I think they are used as an example of a place where Britain left fairly easily, a rare example of where Britain left fairly easily, largely because Britain didn't want to be there in the first place in 1956. So they'd had some history of peace or what have you. And actually, they alternated between dictators and democracy for the first 3 decades of independence. But when large-scale oil and gas resources came into the picture, democracy ended. And I think that's one story that you can tell about Sudan. Another story that I'd be interested in telling about Sudan, I've always wanted to do a series of videos, and I've just never gotten around to it, because it is such a fascinating place. The levels of exploitation here. The reason that Britain was in Sudan in the first place was not their choice at all. Sort of modern Sudanese history starts out not with British imperialism, but with Egyptian imperialism. So you have this fascinating, at least 4 levels of exploitation that are going on here. Sudan, I think, was initially conquered by Muhammad Ali, I believe, in the 1840s or thereabouts, or rather just chunks of Sudan. I think maybe he only got as far down as Khartoum or thereabouts. Then the British take over Egypt in 1881, I believe, and because of this religious fanatic, Gordon, they end up getting literally dragged. Gladstone, the prime minister at the time, really had no interest in the Sudan, get dragged into taking over Sudan. So you've got the British, who are colonizing the Egyptians, who are colonizing the Sudanese Arabs, and then the Sudanese Arabs based in Khartoum colonized South Sudan. Not just South Sudan, but also Darfur. It is a fascinating question. We get into strange ethnic territory here, I guess, from the USI, but these two men, Burhan and Hemeti, identify as and are seen as Arabs, though they may appear, from in the U.S. context, very African American. They are Arabs, and they spend a lot of time, specifically Hemeti, but actually also Burhan, who's in the Sudanese military. These men are Arabs who have spent their entire careers persecuting, managing, fighting insurgencies of black Africans. I'm sure I've become very problematic in ways that I've described that, or this, that, and the other thing, and preemptive apologies or what have you. But it can be quite confusing. But that's those four levels of exploitation that are the story of Sudan. British colonizing the Egyptians, colonizing the Sudanese Arabs, who in turn colonize the blacker Africans of South Sudan and Darfur. So it's quite it's just this incredible hierarchy of exploitation that makes for fascinating history, fascinating stuff. And what has happened over the course of the petroleum development is that the long-standing, probably getting a little confused here, there are so many reasons why Sudan has fallen apart. There's a guy on Twitter who's been giving me a lot of guff because he assumes that I blame the United States for absolutely everything. And I absolutely blame the United States for what's happened to the Sahel over the past decade. For Libya, that was a U.S. choice. What's happened to Iraq, what have you. But there are such fundamental instabilities in Sudan generated by this resource curse, generated by the oil that was supposedly so great for them. Sudan functioned and was able to be independent in the face of pretty large scale U.S. sanctions, famously U.S. bombings of Sudan. There's that pharmaceutical factory that Clinton destroyed. Omar al-Bashir's dictatorship was able to sort of stand up against this because of these oil resources. And this is back in the 90s and the aughts, before the shale revolution. Back in the 90s or the aughts, you'd never be able to see the kinds of sanctions that we have against Iran today. Sudan was sanctioned, but that didn't mean that the Clinton or the Bush administrations were willing to sanction Sudan to the extent where people were penalized for buying Sudanese oil because the world market needed Sudanese oil. So Bashir was able to be a genocidaire in Darfur. He was able to curry favor with al-Qaeda. I think after 9/11, he distanced himself from al-Qaeda. Actually, even before 9/11, he distanced, which is probably why we didn't invade Sudan. But Osama bin Laden spent a lot of the 90s in Sudan. But he was able to be still a very anti-figure in the face of a lot of U.S. rage because he was an oil exporter in an era where oil export was something that the U.S. did not want to get in the way of. That fell apart with the independence of South Sudan in 2013. The interesting thing is that most of South Sudan's oil still goes through Sudan as it is exported to the Red Sea up in the northeast of Sudan, but the actual oil resources are in South Sudan. So what happened was Sudan, this is a lot to do with why the Bashir dictatorship fell apart. Sudan, after the independence of South Sudan in 2013, lost all those financial resources that had allowed Bashir to operate without democracy, without the tolerance of the world hegemon. That all just sort of went away. And I think it's been chaotic in Sudan to a degree ever since. But it did not have to be this way. Sudan is a country that had a more or less functioning democracy in the 1980s, I think also in the 1960s. It is a country that, in part because of these oil and gas resources, does have a lot of civil society resources, a lot of capability to put together a functioning democratic government. Nothing had to go this way, but it is going this way, and it is tremendously damaging, tremendously terrifying, frankly. What have I discussed? Yes, I should briefly go through the outside influences here. I talk a lot about how I prefer Ethiopia. It's a really problematic way to talk about a civil war, but I kind of like the civil war in Ethiopia that just ended because it's not our fault. It's not the problem of the United States. Almost uniquely among large-scale wars in the 21st century, the Ethiopian Civil War had almost no U.S. involvement. I can't say that to the same degree with this Sudanese conflict. The United States has been very involved with and screwing with Sudan for decades now. However, this is not something like Somalia or Ukraine or Iraq, obviously, or Syria, obviously, or Yemen, obviously, where we are directly complicit. I think that the United States generally wants peace and democracy in Sudan and doesn't particularly know or really, frankly, care. I think it should care a little more what's going on with who's Hemeti, who's Burhan. I don't know. Actually, I was surprised and pleased by the Trump administration's willingness to buck Saudi Arabia and the UAE in Sudan. The Trump administration heavily bribed by Saudi Arabia, documented in multiple ways, the Kushner family, what have you. And the Trump administration is very willing to let Saudi Arabia get away with murder in Yemen, with Khashoggi, a lot of other examples. In Sudan, however, it was just far enough away from Israel, frankly, that the Trump administration just didn't care enough to let our instinct for democracy be crushed by Saudi Arabia the way we did in most of the rest of the region. Saudi Arabia and the UAE would obviously vastly prefer that Sudan is run by a junta, whether it's run by Hemeti or run by Burhan. They don't care. They're perfectly happy with military dictatorships. But I think the United States was not. And I think that's why there has been ongoing pressure, why both Hemeti and Burhan have felt the need to at least pretend to care about this democratic transition at differing times and to differing extents. So I think generally U.S. influence has been not awful on this conflict. I think this is to a much higher degree than, say, Ukraine or Libya or Iraq or Syria or Yemen, or even, the Congo. I think this is, to a much larger degree, developed by Sudan's own historic problems. That is not to say that the U.S. is without blame here. I particularly would single out the Trump administration that was good enough to be pro-democracy in Sudan, but also forced a very shaky democratic government into the Abraham Accords with Israel, which is something that, like it or dislike it, it's a simple fact that Arab publics do not like Israel. And if you're trying to build legitimacy for a democratic transition, forcing that democratic transition to make a deal that everybody in the country hates is not a good way to shore up that transition. I'm not saying, and of course, because of the Abraham Accords, there was a coup 6 months later, but that coup 3 to 6 months later was a lot easier to do because the Abraham Accords had undermined the democratic transition elements in Sudan. That was a really bad thing we did. Ongoing decades of sanctions against Sudan certainly didn't help the situation much. But really, I think the U.S. isn't, that bad. I think you can also, I think I mentioned earlier, there's the, wait a second, Hemeti is affiliated with the Wagner Group, so this is all Putin's fault. I think that is also incorrect. I think that, yes, Hemeti is a really, really bad actor. The Rapid Support Forces are genocidaires and mercenaries who have already had an incredibly negative impact. This is Hemeti's crew all over the region. Yes, that's very true, but I don't think this is Russia's fault. UAE and Saudi Arabia, yes, you can definitely start blaming them a little more strongly. Their support of both Burhan and Hemeti has helped to make this worse. There's no question there. Yeah, this is definitely something. I also have seen stuff. I tried to track this down this morning and did not find as good confirmation as I wanted, but enough creditable sources have mentioned that actually Europe was working with sort of the Sudanese Wagner, the Rapid Support Forces, and Hemeti. That some aspects of Europe were working with some aspects of the RSF to help shut down refugee flows. So there are many, many, many outside influences. Sudan is a country that has been shaky and falling apart for quite some time. And outside powers have made things worse. But it's not to the extent of, say, Libya or Ukraine or Iraq or Syria, where outsiders are the most to blame. I think this is a little further along the spectrum towards Ethiopia, Ethiopia I see as almost entirely a self-generated conflict. And I would say Sudan is certainly further along the spectrum in that direction than most of the other conflicts I cover on this channel. I think that's a solid 45 minutes of discussion of this. My one closing point, and I'll jump into Q&A. My one closing point is, and I should probably just do a whole video on this, is the general Africa's borders are unnatural crew is sort of a standard, like, kind of semi-smart thing to say about Africa. And I think that's entirely true. Almost all of the borders in Africa were established by a bunch of white guys in boardrooms in Europe, drawing lines on maps. They're not natural. They aren't akin with whatever ethnic, in tune with whatever ethnic divisions existed at the time, what have you. But I think what's important to remember is that those lines were drawn in Europe coming up on 150 years ago, or 130 years ago. I guess, yeah, it's probably 1890s or thereabouts. So we're talking about a full century of development, in most cases a full half century plus of independent development of these countries. We're talking about the advent of mass literacy. We're talking about the advent of television. We're talking about the advent of radio. All of this happening after these imperialist white men drew these borders. So I think there's this really common, I don't know if it's left wing or right wing, whatever, just sort of sophomoric, sort of both smart and stupid approach to discussing these things, where it's like, well, you have to understand all these borders are artificial, so it's just natural that these borders change. Well, Sudan is your case study for that. Sudan is these borders changing. I would actually argue, I'm incredibly becoming more and more, one thing that I've become more and more suspicious of over the course of spending this past decade just analyzing foreign affairs and the histories of the world, I become massively, massively prejudiced against the idea of border revision. But even I have to concede that South Sudan had the best case out of anything I can see of whether it's on ethnic lines, historic lines, just pure repression lines. I have a really hard time saying that South Sudan should have stayed with Sudan. But considering all of that, it's important to look at what has actually happened in the highest profile case of, let's revise these borders that we've seen in Africa over the past 20 years. What happened was that Sudan was broken up into now Sudan and South Sudan in 2013, to great rejoicing from George Clooney to the U.S. State Department, liberating South Sudan, yippee. And South Sudan promptly fell into one of the largest civil wars of this century, with the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. Sudan itself has limped along in various states of disarray, dictatorship, and horror for the past 2 decades, and it's entirely possible we're about to see it fall into a massive, continent-disturbing, world-shaping civil war. So that's what happens when you revise those borders. So I have very little sympathy for folks who want to talk about, oh yeah, let's just move these borders around and that'll make everything better for Africa. I don't see that happening in Sudan right now, South Sudan or Sudan. I am sympathetic to sort of consolidation, a broader or deeper African Union, or a broader or deeper European Union, broader or deeper NAFTA, broader or deeper Arab League, all for that sort of thing. But that is distinct from like, oh, if we just move this border here, everything will work better. And that has not been this experience of the Sudans. And I think that's something that's important to note. Okay, we are into Q&A. Anything you want to talk about? I have done my presentation on Sudan, and let's talk about literally anything you want to talk about. God damn it, I should have done this on TikTok as well. How embarrassing. Well, I'll set up on TikTok as well. All right. I have a missed call from my mom. Oh, dear. Well, hopefully it wasn't important. Are you here now, Mom? You wanna hit me up in the chat? Okay. Do we have questions? My nickname for Hemeti is Eric Sultan because he's the Arab version of Eric Prince. I think that's a very good point. That's a very good point, Fadal. Yeah, it's part of this just really, really nasty development. We all know and are aware, and we'll talk about how nasty Wagner is, the Russian mercenary forces. Oh dear, sorry. How nasty the Russian mercenary forces are, but we don't talk about how nasty the fact that the United States has massive contracting and mercenary forces now. It's just something we just sort of couldn't go live now. What the hell? Well, I guess I'm not going live on TikTok. What was I talking about? Oh man, I should never look at that phone. There's just so many distracting things I'm thinking about now. Will Erdogan lose the election? That is the $1 million question. That is the $1 trillion question. I think that before the earthquake, the consensus was that Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, the consensus choice of a coalition of opposition parties, was a no-hoper. That earthquake, it's really, I think I looked I think this is across Turkey and Syria, but it is primarily Turkey. I think the body count for that Turkish-Syrian earthquake is coming up to 60,000 people, and that is horrific. It was in part, one of the reasons why Erdogan came to power in the first place was the chaos. It was just one element of a multi-element polycrisis, if you will. But the main reason why one of the main reasons why the AK Party came to power in 2003 was the aftermath of a really nasty earthquake in 1999 in Turkey that killed like 20,000 people. This earthquake killed 60,000 people. And I think the extent to which it's really disturbed Turkish politics to the extent where, yes, Erdogan could really lose this election. Talking to a few people, it seems like the consensus seems to be that Erdogan's just not doing anything. He just sort of assumes he's going to win, hasn't really launched his messaging campaign about Kılıçdaroğlu. I don't know, is he just going to arrest him? I don't know. I think the consensus is that maybe Erdogan doesn't realize how much trouble he's in. There are elements of sort of superstition and in politics that people don't acknowledge. But just having this earthquake happen so soon before this election, it's almost like It's weird. Put this in Chinese terms. It's almost like the mandate of heaven has been lifted from Erdogan and handed on off to Kılıçdaroğlu. I mean, it does seem like God wants Erdogan to lose, but Erdogan's defeated a lot of things, and defeated many things. So you shouldn't count him out. But it's looking real possible, and I think that a lot of people just sort of assume that Erdogan's immortal. He's this dictator. He controls all the systems. That he's never going to lose power, what have you. But that is not guaranteed. It is entirely possible that on May 15th, for the first time in 2 decades, we could have a different government in Turkey. And that would be honestly terrifying. I think that the opposition is terrified by this prospect. I think a lot of people are terrified by this prospect, but I think it would be very, very good for Turkey, even if we have like an Israel situation where some, ridiculous coalition fights among itself for 6 months before Erdogan comes roaring back. Even if that were to be the case, it would be a good thing for Turkey, and it would be a good reminder that Turkey is actually a democracy. I think that would be a really positive development for the world to have Erdogan lose, and a really positive development for Turkey. Not saying it's going to happen, but I'm saying it's looking a lot more possible than it used to. Reynold Cherry asks, who benefits from this Sudan instability geopolitically? Well, the Arab princes of the world, the people who benefit from instability and destruction. The mercenary companies like Hemedti's RSF. The RSF obviously has real roles within Sudan, but has functioned like the Wagner Group. I can't remember what it was. So Eric Prince is the guy who ran Blackwater. I think Blackwater has changed names 4 times by now, or that actual entity might be bankrupt. So it's a completely different set of circumstances now. But the people who benefit are the people who benefit from destruction. I don't think. Now, normally I just default to, the military-industrial complex and those evil bastards those evil bastards are the real problem. But I think that they're getting all they need out of Ukraine. Aren't letting go of Iran. I don't know that the really ruinous and horrific thing is that I think the army gets more to do in Africa, but I mean it's mostly just sort of another thing for the special forces to do. It's like I just don't think even the U.S. military-industrial complex benefits that much from this level of chaos and destruction. So I do think. Perhaps Reynold, you're looking for like a more sort of sinister background reason why this Sudan thing has happened, but I don't think anybody really benefits other than war profiteers like Blackwater, which is not a company that currently exists, but whatever the Blackwater successor groups are, or Wagner, or just mercenary companies. That's who benefits geopolitically. And I think that it's really, really bad for the whole North African coast there. All of those countries, to some degree, are dealing with bad refugee flow problems. This will increase them. This will make Europe more vicious with its border controls. This is, and the chain reaction thing is a real concern. People should still be concerned about the potential of Egyptian state failure, and having Sudan go completely Mad Max directly to the north, directly to the south of Egypt, makes Egypt going Mad Max more possible as well. So I don't see a benefit anywhere for anybody. I think that it's just I think that even the UAE and Saudi Arabia benefit from being able to use Sudanese soldiers now that the Pakistanis seem to be pretty done with that sort of thing. Sudanese soldiers were very useful for the invasion of Yemen, as just one example. But I don't think even Saudi Arabia and the UAE benefit from this level of instability in Sudan. I think Saudi Arabia and the UAE very interested in developing agricultural resources in Sudan, and you're not gonna be shipping any farm goods out of Sudan if things continue on this level. So yeah, it's really, really grim. Fadal, I did not see what you read about Sudan in the Discord. I guess I can try to do that. Now, why the hell? Oh, I couldn't go live now. Why can't I go live? Sorry, TikTok irritating me. Okay, Discord, was this in the Africa? It's the MENA, right? What did you write about Sudan? It has parallels with Sisi's Egypt. Today, Egypt produces many fewer educated people. Okay, so that's a Turkey thing. Hemedi is the worst. The more one reads of him, the clearer it is how he's just a more repulsive version of Burhan and the military. The Emiratis are the ones lobbying for him the most. The RSF is mostly made up of tribesmen from Darfur. There are some Arab Chadians in there too. Is that what you're talking about? It is a mess. That is definitely the case. Yes, I read what you wrote about Sudan in the Discord file. I think that was fairly on point. An interesting dynamic between the RSF and the Sudanese armed forces is that you could, on some level, see the Sudanese armed forces as sort of the forces of the cities, whereas the RSF, made up of sort of Arab tribesmen who had been useful for genocide purposes to the Sudanese state, but are now kind of bringing that level of conflict and nastiness to the cities, to the elites, for lack of a better word. It's nasty. It is nasty. Yamluk asks, where do you think the Horn of Africa is heading? I think that's an interesting question. There's some interesting developments. I think that Abiy Ahmed kind of looks like a big winner, which is kind of surprising. I think I and other YouTube channels and a lot of media resources kind of got over our skis talking about how the Tigrayans were going to defeat or humiliate Abiy Ahmed. This is the prime minister, president, I think, is the president of Ethiopia. That is not, in fact, what happened. It is a country of 110 million. It is the heart of the Horn of Africa, and it has consolidated. It seems to have won its war against the Tigrayans. Of course, that means that they've also got to focus on their war against the Amhara and the Oromo. The Amhara and the Oromo are the largest ethnic groups in Ethiopia, I believe. The Tigrayans were the small minority that used to run Ethiopia between 1992 and 2018. So Abiy Ahmed has other fights to fight, but I've got to believe that those fights are going to be easier than the Tigrayan fight that he seems to have survived or become victorious in. There are also supposedly somewhat positive news out of Somalia. My understanding is that the Somali government is beginning to take some territory back from al-Shabaab, the terrorist group that controls large swaths of territory in Somalia. I am always dubious about these sorts of things because, yeah, they can be positive for a while and then they just sort of fall apart because something changes. That one thing that has changed could be the destabilization of Sudan. Who freaking knows? However, I think that the destabilization of Sudan takes a lot of pressure off of Abiy Ahmed in Ethiopia. Actually, we've got the map right here, so why not? Where did I put that? So if Sudan falling apart completely means that Abiy Ahmed is going to face less pressure from Egypt and Sudan, who were beginning to gang up on Ethiopia over a dam. So if Abiy Ahmed is feeling more consolidated, he is also an anti-al-Shabaab actor. He is presumably, I am not familiar with the minutiae here, but I also believe that he would be on the same side as the United States and the official Mogadishu government of Somalia. So that you can tell a story where actually maybe the Horn begins to consolidate as Sudan and everything west of Sudan falls into deeper nightmare. But I think that the nightmare of Sudan and further is likely to fall apart, is likely to impact the Horn of Africa as well, and negatively. So yeah, I hope that was helpful, Jan-Mark. And maybe I missed it, but has this got anything to do with the Navy base of Russia? Is the Cold War type thing the U.S. and Russia? Russia cannot be that strong. Yeah, I don't think it's. I think that that is definitely a dynamic. That was on my list of outside influences. Yes, Russia had a deal with Omar al-Bashir to build a naval base on the Red Sea, Sudan, and Burhan did not renege on that the way I'm sure the U.S. wanted him to. But I think that can be oversold as far as like Burhan being a Russian pawn or something like that. I think both of these actors, Burhan and Hemeti, are just taking money from anybody they can. It's what they do. Yeah. So I just don't think that it's a what's the word I'm looking for? Something to blame on new Cold War stuff. I think that's sort of the instinct. It's like, oh, this is part of the new Cold War, this, that, and the other thing, and I just don't see that as particularly credible. Nigeria will suffer it the most. Libya fall. Well, Libya fall. Libya has sort of fallen. Libya just continues to fall. I think Fadel on the patrons only Discord, which you can sign up for if you are a patron, has been suggesting that it's even possible that there'd be some positive impacts on Libya. This would undermine Haftar, the strongman in the east. I'm not sure if I really buy that. I think that chaos can lead to chaos, but who knows? Maybe it'll be better for Libya if it undermines Haftar and makes it possible for better things to happen. Can't really say. Nigeria is further away from Sudan than others, and Nigeria is dealing with so many of its own. Well, no, actually, it's just got Chad in between. Yeah, this could definitely make things worse for Nigeria. Jesus. Oof. No bueno. It's not good, folks. Habibi says, as a Horn African, our region has countries that exist purely on military strength with support of geopolitical allies. I think that would be a fair description. The Attack Titan asks, your take on Macron's visit to China. I'm embarrassed I have not actually read the Politico interview that was supposedly so damaging and so atrocious. But essentially Macron made a lot of international news by saying exactly what he's been saying for years. I think probably he's been quiet about it for the past year since Europe and the U.S. got so much more firmly back in bed to deal with the Ukraine issue. But Macron has been quite straightforward, quite explicit, and I think largely correct for the past entire time he's been in power. Yeah, gosh, Macron's been around for a little while now, hasn't he? Is he edging towards a decade already? That can't be right. But certainly it's more than 5 years, right? But Macron has always emphasized that Europe should have its own self-defense capabilities. There should be a more unified European armed force that is outside of NATO. That Europe cannot depend on the United States for its security needs to stop doing that. That's all still true. And I think what specifically sent Washington, D.C. into a spiral was his suggestion that, and I think the sound bites or the clips that were used went further in the direction, sort of, we're taken a little out of context. He didn't go so far as to say Europe shouldn't back up the United States over Taiwan. What he said was stuff that Europe should make its own determinations about whether it makes sense to back Taiwan and to what extent. And that just strikes me as things that should be obviously true. I think what's the main takeaway for me from Macron's making this splash here, and I think he gave this interview on the way back from a meeting with Xi Jinping. I think the main takeaway here is not that, France is about to go pull a de Gaulle again and ally with our enemies. I think my main takeaway is just how right Macron has always been about this stuff, and how sad and how failed he has been in convincing anybody to agree with him on it. What do you think about Ghana? I have not put a ton of thought into Ghana. My understanding is that it is certainly in the top 10 in Africa in terms of development and possibility. Doesn't Ghana have a sort of strange, almost unique ethnic unity? Unity overstates it, I'm sure, but it seems like has fewer ethnic problems than other countries. Understanding is it's actually had a pretty good century so far. And then, of course, that it was the first COVID debt default. So I think Ghana's got some problems, but I think its fundamentals are pretty good. And Ghana's a place we can be hopeful about. But I don't know. I haven't really looked into the details. Is Ghana's situation going to worsen? I think everybody's situation in Africa is going to worsen. And I think a lot depends. Ghana is, I think, what is it? Ghana, I think, has moved up the value chain a bit, but I think is still very dependent. I can't remember what the actual resource is, but is very dependent on commodity exports still. So I just feel like I'm not super optimistic about Africa in the short term, to be quite clear. That's funny. I didn't get that conversation. Fadal, you're actually very accurate. Peter Zeihan seems to be the new updated version of the intellectual dark web folks. That's funny. The UAE imports $17 billion of smuggled gold, presumably, from Sudan annually, supporting Hemedti as part of NBC's economic diversification strategy. That's a shame. Loga asks, why is Hemedti crying for U.S. intervention on Twitter in what can only be described as like a whiny little bitch? That is an interesting question. One would hope that that's because the RSF is doing poorly and he might be about to lose, but I think that would be a very early assumption to make. I think that it's sort of roiling the waters. Sudan is a country that's really dependent on, it's confusing the issue. Sudan is a country that is very dependent on a wide array of geopolitical actors. It is more important. Abiy Ahmed, when people were calling him a genocidaire, arguably accurately, over the past 3 years, he could say, well, F you, this is just the CIA and I hate you all. And largely get away with it because he's in large degree of power over a country of 100 million. The Sudanese civil war folks are playing a big political game, not just nationally but internationally. And I actually I think someone was joking on Twitter, but it was in the YouTube comments this morning talking about, wait a second, isn't Hemedti the human rights guy who is on the side of the democratic transition? Hemedti has very consciously portrayed himself that way. He's also the guy who's in charge of forces who are raping and killing their way across Khartoum as we speak. He is also a guy who came up, built his political power base through a genocide. So yeah, he's doing a savvy job of portraying himself as the guy who cares about humanitarianism and democratic transition, but nobody should believe that. What do you think about Botswana? I think I was just, what was it, just recent episode of the Odd Lots podcast, I think highlighted Botswana as a development success story. I think they have a lot of diamonds, and really since independence, they've done a pretty good job of maintaining, actually rising above the resource curse, and apparently using that diamond wealth fairly well to build human development indicators in Botswana. It's sort of a rare, very happy story. I think, unfortunately, because the neighborhoods can be unstable, because things just happen. This was certainly the case with Ethiopia. Recently, you have and Ghana. Ghana is a very happy story. I think still is a very happy story, but it just had a debt default. That's not happy or good. But Botswana is a country that, since independence, has just sort of consistently been a happy story, and that's great and rare. Onasi says, "Hey Mo, do you think the Ukrainian counteroffensive will yield positive results? I've seen General Ben Hodges say that it will all be over by year's end." Sure, yeah, everyone will be home by Christmas, right? I'm pretty pessimistic about the Ukrainian war ending quickly. I would love it if it did. I would love it if it ended in a Ukrainian victory, to the extent that Putin doesn't, end up bombing human civilization out of existence. I don't think that the U.S. should support a Ukrainian effort to take Crimea. I think the U.S. should, to an extent, support Ukraine's efforts to take back the rest of the country, frankly, even Luhansk and Donetsk. But I'm not super optimistic or excited about this. I am very conscious that Putin did an evil thing here. He made the choice to invade his neighbor with his sort of poor man's George W. Bush routine, and I want to see him punished for that. I don't want to see Russia profit from this, but I'm also very conscious that the United States worked very hard for decades to set this trap that he walked into. So I would vastly prefer that this war ends as soon as possible, but if it can end with a Ukrainian pushing back of most of Russia's gains, I'd also like that as well. But mostly I'd just like the war to end. And that goes with, maybe that's just my bias, that I'm somewhat skeptical that the Ukrainians are going to be able to have large breakout victories. But you know what? I was fairly skeptical that they were going to have large breakout victories before they kicked ass in Kharkiv and before they kicked ass in Kherson. So maybe I'm wrong about that. However, since those huge victories in Kharkiv and Kherson, there has been a mass mobilization of the Russian military. And while I don't think that means that the Russians are going to have the capacity, as we're seeing in Bakhmut, they clearly don't, or at least have not yet been able to turn that mobilization into the capacity necessary to do real conquering of Ukrainian territory. I do think that just that level of cannon fodder is going to make it a lot easier for them to hold on to the lines in Ukraine that they have established. So I don't have a lot of faith in this upcoming Ukrainian counteroffensive. I have a lot of hope. I'm not making any kind of, maybe there's serious possibilities there. I think the recent leaked documents make it seem less likely that the Ukrainian counteroffensive is going to be super successful. But you know what? The Ukrainians have surprised us to the upside over and over and over again in this conflict, so maybe they can. So I don't know. Local Extreme says, in what way has the U.S. failed in the Ukraine crisis? Honestly, I mean, I have a lot of I don't think this war would have happened if we hadn't expanded NATO. I don't think this war would have happened if, even after Russia invaded Ukraine with the Crimea annexation, I don't think it had to get to this point, and it wouldn't have gotten to this point if it weren't for the panic after the 2016 election and this fantasy that Russia had something to do with Hillary Clinton losing. I think that there are a lot of points at which this war could have been averted if the United States had acted in a saner, less aggressive way towards Russia. I think that fundamentally Russia under Gorbachev decided to end the Cold War. Yeah, you can make all kinds of arguments that, oh, well, they were bankrupt. They couldn't have. It could have been bloodier. It could have literally ended human civilization. And Russia made the mature, better choice to simply say, sorry, oh, come on. Great. I think that Russia made the decision to end the Cold War. I think that they made the decision to try to work with Europe and the United States, and we pissed in their face. I think that there's a lot of talk about, oh, Russia always conquers, Russia bad imperialist history, blah, 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 blah. Well, if you think that Russia has some kind of unique imperialist history, that just means you don't know any European or frankly U.S. history before 1945. We had Gorbachev, and we pissed in his face. And turned him into probably one of the most uniquely impressive and virtuous figures in modern history, and we turned him into a joke. He died in Russia, forgotten and hated, because of he tried for peace, and the U.S. said, "Nah, fuck you. We're just going to keep fighting the Cold War." I think the mistakes that the U.S. made were in taking Russia's offered hand and taking a dump in it. That's what we did for 3 decades. We are the reason that Vladimir Putin is in power and has been in power this long. It is our encirclement of Russia that turned them into this vicious nightmare state that undertook this very evil invasion. So those are the mistakes, I think, that, those were our failures in the Ukraine crisis. As far as since 2022, I think we've been doing all right. I think Biden actually deserves some credit for ignoring a lot of hawks and doing what was necessary to help a truly inspiring and surprising Ukrainian resistance hold on, but not pushing it towards the level of nuclear war. Yeah, that's my thoughts on the Ukraine thing. Well, thank you, Bored, very bored. That's a generous super chat, and he says, "Hey man, I just want to say I really appreciate your content. You have some of the best takes out there." Well, thank you. I aspire to be a solid take meister. But yeah, thank you for the super chat. Very generous. Do you have a question, Bored, very bored? You've generously contributed, so I should answer your question. The Attack Titan. How will this instability affect Morocco and Algeria, if any? Morocco and Algeria are a little more distant from Sudan. Well, a lot more distant, and they've got a lot of very solid Sahara in between them and what's happening. I think that Algeria has certainly been impacted by Libya's disintegration. It won't do anything particularly positive for Morocco or Algeria. They will have to deal with more refugee flows, for sure. But they are, I think, insulated enough by the Sahara that it's not going to be as direct a problem for Morocco and Algeria as it is for the rest of North Africa, is my hope. Such a nationalist. Who's such a nationalist? We have no more questions, huh? I mean, should we just leave early? We've got 72 people here. Apparently, there must be more questions, more things we'd like to talk about. Daxton Min says, I think that the Chinese have had a pretty good year so far. A diplomatic win in Europe and stronger than expected GDP growth. Yeah, I think, did I do a short on this? I thought I did a short on this. I think that, I certainly know that was it No Opinion put out a Substack thing talking about how like, oh, the Empire Strikes Back. I was like, dude, the Empire Strikes Back. That was 2022. That was we're the Empire. But anyway, but yeah, I think that 2022 was a really horrific year for Xi Jinping in China, and the expectation that they were just going to keep spinning off into crisis and failure was overblown. I think they had a well, it's funny that like it is important to report that they were reported to have this extraordinary, super impressive economic quarter, and they did, but it was like 5%. Like 5% growth is what China calls impressive right now, which is again, better than the U.S. will ever put up, but is not what it was used to be. And this is a quarterly growth figure. So if everyone's very excited about a 5% quarterly growth figure, that usually ends up averaging out to significantly lower than that annually. So people can overstate it, but yes, like China had a good economic quarter. Yes, China seems to. Was it Zhao Lijian? Is that his name? The wolf warrior, the most famous asshole. Yeah, I think that's fair. Use of profanity. The most famous sort of asshole China diplomat is no longer making his pronouncements. He's been sort of shuffled off into a less important job. I think Xi Jinping and others in the Chinese leadership have realized that they're sort of like, we're going to out-Trump Trump. Policy was actually an incredible screw up, and now they're beginning to try to sort of take advantage of a lot of the incredibly obvious, easy things for them to take advantage of with the United States' let's start wars everywhere policy. I think China has realized, had they realized this, had they made this shift in 2017, we'd have a very different world and a U.S. hegemony that was in probably not like serious existential danger, but was a lot more threatened than it is right now. But I do think that no matter how well things go for China this year and the coming years, I am not somebody who thinks that China's about to fall apart. They do have massive crises coming. Not a collapse, maybe a collapse of the Chinese Communist Party in my lifetime. Certainly, I think the chances of a collapse of Xi Jinping before having to leave power before he wants to, I think chances of that are pretty high. What was I going to say? So I think it can be overstated that, China's back. But I think that the 2022, COVID zero, real estate collapse, so sort of that general humiliation of maybe not within China, but the rest of the world being like, like Xi Jinping has a freaking, China's got a new Mao now. That level of Chinese failure was not something we were going to see consistently and all the time. And I think that's a good thing to realize, that over the coming years, and I think Washington, D.C. will blow this out of proportion. China's back. China's coming for us. Get more worried about China. But China's not going to fail as massively and ridiculously every year as it failed in 2022. Sorry, I feel like I took much longer to say that than I should have. I've got 2 super chats to catch up with now. Jeez. Fadel says, Hemeti will hold out for a while in Darfur. To shorten the war, we need to go after his income sources. The problem, though, isn't like, maybe I'm over, there's a great tweet from, was it Nick Brumfield or someone he'd retweeted, being like, please don't read Adam Tooze on Sudan. He just thinks the world is a fun puzzle for him to figure out, which is probably true, but I really enjoy watching Adam Tooze figure out the world's fun puzzle, even if he's perhaps inadequately sensitive to the death and destruction that he is talking about. But Adam Tooze had a big article talking about the roots of this conflict in artisanal gold production. Sudan lost South Sudan's oil sources, but what's really come on stream is a vein of gold that has been discovered apparently across the Sahel.
And the Sudanese government sort of assumed that they could develop those gold resources sort of top down, centralized, the way they had developed the oil resources. But actually, the gold is accessible enough that a lot of private actors are able to just go in and get the gold and develop it and ship it out. Artisanal mining is a really dark term, or rather, it's a really, you think artisanal, you think like, for me, growing up in the United States, I think of like hipster candle makers up in upstate New York or something along those lines. No, artisanal mining means mining with no protections, like 19th century style, often child labor involved in incredibly unhealthy environments, going out and extracting minerals. So, but it also means it's sort of low capital requiring, which means that militias or people can just have this sort of Wild West type thing. So what's going on in Darfur is this sort of Wild West gold extraction. And I think that's going to be kind of hard to shut down, especially when we consider the just sort of relative lack of coherence of a lot of those neighbors. So you've got Darfur is sort of this southwest chunk of Sudan there. Chad is not the most stable. Central African Republic is not the most stable. South Sudan is not the most stable. So how do we actually stop Hemeti from producing all that gold? I admire your confidence, actually, that Hemeti is going to be kicked out of Khartoum. I mean, I think like one model of the fighting thus far is that actually what happened was the RSF launched this fighting in Khartoum to try to take over the capital city, and that's not really their natural environment, whereas their natural environment is more sort of Darfur and the rest of the hinterlands. And they're going to fail to take Khartoum, so they're going to be holed up in Darfur. And the problem is that this fighting in Khartoum seems to be continuing and even intensifying, as what the news that I've seen today. So that's kind of worrisome. But so let's see. Yeah. So who knows? Maybe Hemeti can hold out for a while. Maybe he can't. But I would love it if we got to that situation rather quickly, where we can just sort of deal with the fact that Hemeti is in Darfur and being a problem, rather than destabilizing the entire country. That would be a good result, as far as I'm concerned at this point. As Jetpack asks, what do you think of the Belt and Road loan defaults? Wasn't there some concession this past week? I did not dive into it. The big concern, so what we're dealing with right now, this is a U.S. thing, is a second Volcker shock. Do you guys know what I'm talking about when I talk about the Volcker shock? This is in the 1970s, after the United States got off of the gold standard, after the oil crisis. In the late 1970s, the United States, I think hyperinflation overstates it, but the United States got into a situation of large and growing inflation. And what happened with that inflation was, but it got worse and worse and worse. We had something called stagflation, sort of a stagnant economy and inflation. And what happened was Carter installed a chairman of the Federal Reserve named Paul Volcker, who carried out the Volcker shock through the Carter and Reagan administrations, which was basically a dramatic rise in interest rates. When those interest rates went up, there were knock-on effects. That meant interest rates went up everywhere in the world. That meant that the developing world writ large, Latin America, Africa, Asia, that had been able to borrow money at lower rates in the 60s and 70s, all of a sudden had to deal with exorbitantly higher rates, which meant that basically everybody defaulted on their debts. It's interesting. Actually, there was a really great Odd Lots podcast recently. It's a Bloomberg podcast I listen to more or less, talking about how economic development seems to be slowing down more generally. I think that's available for free wherever you get podcasts. It's one of the more recent ones. I'd recommend listening to it. Talking about how actually the 1980s and 1990s are remembered in the United States and Europe as sort of somewhat go-go economic ways, but times, but really in the developing world, we're just a horror show, like really nightmarishly bad, economically, politically, socially, what have you. Unfortunately, and that was developed with some other reasons, the oil shock and the Volcker shock, which is a result of the oil shock. We've got a new Volcker shock going. That's what's happening. I think people have even said, if depending on how you do the math, proportionally, I mean, the Volcker shock went much higher. I think we had U.S. interest rates in the 12 to 15% range or something along those lines. But that was coming up from a base of 5 or 6%. In the United States, we've gone from 10, 15 years of essentially 0% interest rates to 5% interest rates immediately. I think some people I think I read something saying this is like the fastest in history. So that's exactly the same knock-on effect. Developing countries all over the world have been borrowing money for very low rates for 15 years now, and now, boom, it's now 5 to 10%. And that is a new massive shock. This is, of course, on top of the COVID shocks that everyone was already absorbing. I think it's Sri Lanka and Ghana are just the first of the countries to default entirely, but it's expected to happen on a mass level. In the aftermath of this incredible range of debt defaults and human misery that we saw as a result of the Volcker shock across the developed world, there were a number of across the developing world, there were a number of developed world programs to deal with that. The IMF has, I was reading about that a couple days back, the IMF has a whole class or program that's been running for 20 years, which is like, there's an acronym for it, but it's basically like poor country debt relief or something along those lines. And the whole sort of, essentially the United States and Europe got together to decide, well, according to a set of evolving criteria, this country is obviously never going to be able to pay back this debt. We'll forgive this level of debt. This country is obviously never going to be able to do this sort of thing, so we'll just forgive this. So there is a mechanism, and hopefully this kind of thing will happen more efficiently this time around, of the big debtor countries getting together and being like, is that the creditor? The countries that are owed the money getting together and saying, look, obviously these countries are not going to be able to do this. Let's forgive some of this debt and allot that pain in the appropriate way so this country can move forward. I don't want to make this sound heroic. I think that probably debt forgiveness should be on a much larger level. A lot of these debts should have never been made. A lot of these loans should never have been made in the first place. What is different now is that it is not just the United States and Europe making these sorts of decisions. It is China as well. And China apparently doesn't like forgiving debt. It likes rescheduling debt. China's approach to a lot of these debt, Belt and Road folks who are beginning to default is not saying, okay, well, you don't have to pay back 20% of this. They say, okay, we'll just expand the terms. You can pay us back the same amount. You're going to pay us back the same fucking money, but you can do it over 10 years instead of 5 years. That's apparently what China prefers, and it is more difficult. Now, I go back and forth on this. I think the practicalities, it makes it more difficult and worse. I think philosophically and maybe in the long term, this could be better. But the practicalities of China saying, wait, I want to do it my way, and then US and Europe being like, no, we need to get on the same page about this. I think that does make debt forgiveness more difficult, makes things more complex. But I think generally, I think it's probably a good thing that the developing world has someone else who's competing to loan them money now. I think that's probably a good thing, and I hope it persists. It's worth pointing out that despite the amount of time we spend complaining about Belt and Road and talking as if it's this massive, massive threat in the United States, I think it's been shrinking since 2016. largely considered to be kind of a failure by the Chinese. So yeah. Bored, very bored. What is your opinion on the state of the UK right now? Obviously, I know it's not in a great place currently, but I'd still like to ask you. I am not very optimistic about the United Kingdom. I am a huge Anglophile. Family has always been a fan. We probably visited London more as a kid than we did the rest of the United States. Always, love the country and its history. Obviously, I wrote a book about about the empire. But yeah, since Brexit, I just find myself less. I know, this happens. I get less interested in topics and revisit them. I'm actually having a fascinating time sort of revisiting a lot of Turkish history, some of which I participated in, because I've got to make some videos about this election that's upcoming. After not really focusing on Turkey much for a couple of years, I'm enjoying that. But yeah, with the UK, it's just sort of like, why would I care? It's like it's just like some island. It's not with Brexit. It chose to take itself out of the mainstream of political development. It is slowly sliding down the list of most powerful countries on a range of metrics. Brexit, everybody, myself included. I've got like 6 or 7 produced videos I made back in 2016 talking about what a bad idea Brexit would be. It hasn't been exactly as bad or the ways it was going to be bad that I said it was, but it's been a real incredible screw up. I think that everybody was sort of laughing at the British right-wing folks absolutely losing their minds at Joe Biden's sort of tour to Ireland. I think he met Rishi Sunak in Northern Ireland, which is still a part of the United Kingdom. Rishi Sunak being the Prime Minister of the UK, in sort of like a half-assed like diner meetup or something like that, and then spent like the rest of the week doing this absurd tour of every county of Ireland or what have you. And I think that's kind of amusing. I do think, honestly, I do think it's a little, even if he's now fully rehabilitated, I do think it's a little messed up that he was sort of having smiley pictures with Jerry Adams, who is I think a reformed terrorist, I think is a fair way to describe him. Maybe it's an unfair way to describe him, but Biden is a old school East Coast politician, and he's going to be a lot of that old school politics is about repping Ireland. But just to see the British just absolutely lose their minds over that, especially sort of the same right-wing people who put Britain in this position of growing irrelevance with Brexit. So yeah, I love the United Kingdom, and I want good things for it, but I don't. I got friends who are already considering leaving. Folks with other passports who are just sort of like, I don't really need to be here anymore. I don't. Yeah. So, I'm sure the UK will figure it out. But they should start figuring on it. And maybe something will happen that'll get me more interested in the UK again right now. But I just don't have. I can tell you who the Prime Minister is. But I am not as engaged with British politics as I was when British politics mattered more. So there's that. That's about what I have to say about the UK right now. I hope that's not disappointing. Thank you so much for the super chats. Actually, very bored. That's very generous. Thank you. Who will win the 2024 election, and what are Trump's chances? I think that the chances are. I think it's really depressing, but I think the chances are pretty high now that we're going to get a Biden-Trump rerun, and I think that Biden will win. To be clear, I'd much rather Biden would win than Trump, but I think I think basically it comes to, can Biden still make coherent sentences in the debates between Trump and Biden? I think that's the key question. If he can, then... then if Biden can still string together sentences in the debate in the 2024 fall debates, then he will be president for the next 4 years if he's running against Trump. Honestly, though, like, I do think that maybe I should have put more thought into this. Yeah, I think I've got some videos where I'm like, oh, DeSantis is going to be the next president, or not talking about it like that was like a possibility. Like, it's just that looks more and more farcical if you just consider just how Donald Trump is popular, and Donald Trump he is popular with the Republican base, and Donald Trump has made, as insane and crazy as he is, Donald Trump has made some really basic, sane changes to the Republican Party platform. He has said we're not going to go after Medicare and Social Security, and we should stop fighting all these fucking wars. Every dumbass who's trying to run against Donald Trump is trying to run like a 2012 Republican, including Ron DeSantis, except just like a little more freaked out about gay people. Like, that's really it. That's it. Like, they're trying to run on tax cuts and more money for... If Donald Trump had actually run the country as the person he had campaigned as, the guy who, wanted to be anti-elite and wanted to end wars, he'd still be president today, for sure, 100%. Instead, he ended up governing as the same shitty Republican that Ron DeSantis is running to be, which is someone who's going to cut Medicare and Social Security, is somebody who's gonna get into more wars and somehow make up for it by hating on black people and gay people. Nobody's really interested in that anymore. Even the Republican base isn't interested in that anymore. So yeah, I think if Donald Trump is still alive, he's going to be the Republican nominee. And if Joe Biden can still string together a coherent sentence at the debate, he's going to be president for 8 years. Anything can happen, anything can change, but that seems likely. Is the dollar really in danger in 2023? No, I don't think so. Yeah. I was surprised. It's just, I was talking to someone whose opinion I respect, and he was like, oh, well, maybe this BRICS thing is serious. And I went and researched it again. And I was like, no, it's not. It's just not. Like, the BRICS currency stuff, there's like different things. The BRICS currency reserve, which is just like supposedly like this new joint reserves account that has $100 million, which is like ridiculous. That is no money if you're talking about sovereign states. Yeah, I can't find any, supposedly there's going to be some kind of like alternative currency being rolled out. Lula's talking about stuff. I just don't see it. I just don't see it. Oh, God. Yeah, Donald Trump isn't capable of fixing anything. Trump had to do was pretend to care about COVID, and he'd have won. Yeah, probably. De Blasio and Cuomo were lousy in handling COVID, and their approval rating went up to the high 60s and 70s. Yeah. Well, New York is very different from Trump. But yeah, no, he could have... There are a lot of things that Trump could have done to stay in power, no question. Reynold Cherry says... I don't think there's any real danger to the dollar in 2023. I don't think there's any real danger to U.S. empire this decade. I think that's just where we're at. I mean, there's no real danger to the U.S. empire this decade other than the Pentagon or the U.S. foreign policy establishment and the way that they just keep dragging us into more violence. Can Trump make a coherent sentence? That's a great question, but I think he's been intellectually limited for longer than Biden has, so he's more used to it. Evan T. What's your thoughts on left politics on the internet and YouTube? You've made a vid on Kraut, but Chapo Trap House also comes to mind. I mean, I listened to Chapo Trap House, actually. I have for years. But I just don't, and there's certainly things that they get wrong, but like I just don't have the, and also like they're a lot less interesting than they used to be. To be clear, I think they're still sort of running on the fumes of Bernie's campaigns for president, and I think they're now quite explicitly just trying to build up their comedy careers with like a political vibe. But yeah, yeah, it's funny. I'd never really thought of trying to do a video critiquing Chapo Trap House. I wonder if that would do well. I just think because I don't think of them as YouTubers because they're not. They're podcasters. But it's interesting how to try to make that a visual element. Wow, that's an interesting question. I don't know. So the USA will stay out of the Sudan conflict, I take it. That is my fond hope and expectation. Yes, that we will stay out of this Sudan conflict. That would be very much for the best. I mean, like, and to be clear, like, I absolutely would not want anybody to get involved, any outside actor to get involved in this fight militarily. But to the extent that the U.S. State Department or other outside actors can act to help Burhan over Hemeti, I think that's the right thing to do, unfortunately. I don't like it. Absolutely, there should be no military intervention, but yeah, I think that's probably the right thing to do. So we should stay out of this conflict physically, no question, but if there are sane, limited things that we can do that help Burhan and hinder Hemeti, that's probably the right thing to do. Obviously not like a long-term endorsement of Hemeti being in charge of the country or anything, but yeah, it's just much better. It's Burhan, as bad as he is better than Hemeti. Pakistan in 2023. I'm sorry, Jack. I have not done a serious dive on Pakistan recently. I do think I made a short pointing out that it is kind of interesting that, I mean, honestly, there's weird parallels between Pakistan and the United Kingdom, actually. The choices that the Pakistani government made, specifically continuing to back the Taliban for all those years, ended up with all of a sudden Pakistan being a lot less important to the United States. And also Pakistan's choice, the right choice, not to back up Saudi Arabia in Yemen. 100% the right thing to do. But I think that combined with the end of the U.S. interest in Afghanistan means that neither of the main sponsors of Pakistan's dysfunction over the past frickin' half century are really interested in backing them up anymore. And I think that's terrifying in some ways. Pakistan, it remains the scariest and least stable nuclear country on the planet. That's not great. So obviously, the understandable lack of interest or tolerance on the part of Saudi Arabia and the U.S. for Pakistan's shenanigans should be tempered by the fact that we don't want this place to fall apart. But it is kind of fascinating how Pakistan is just like not a priority for a lot of the people it used to be a priority for. And I think that's probably Pakistan's main problem right now. What's going to happen with Imran Khan? What's going to happen with anything else? I couldn't tell you. I think Pakistan is probably one of the countries that's, definitely one of the countries that's at risk for default. I think they're in the midst of negotiating a new IMF package at the moment. So yeah, worrisome. But I guess I wish them well. And I should probably look into it more because Pakistan is, unlike the UK, it's not just going to be falling away into being boring. It's going to fall away into being probably more dangerous. Do you listen to Sam Cedar? I don't, actually. There's a Majority Report. I know that I've seen clips now and again, but I've never really And it was Michael Brooks was on that show, right? And everybody loved Michael Brooks, and I've always enjoyed the clips of his that I've listened to. What's the Sudanese conflict's impact on OPEC, OPEC Plus? I don't know the extent to which South Sudan's oil production has been disrupted already. I know that Sudan is I just don't know. What is that? South Sudan oil production 22. So that's, oh Jesus, South Sudan has dropped to 140,000, 160. So that's enough South Sudan is an extraordinarily poor country. And that, 200,000 barrels a day would have been enough to have a huge impact on all of Sudan. But that's not like a systemically important number. That's a fairly low number. Like Yemen actually has an oil industry that's fairly important to Yemen, but it's on such a low level that it's not like it seems like South Sudan and Sudan are in a similar position. Habibi says, Oromo, do you think the Amhara-Oromo political rivalry in Ethiopia, which was very close to leading to an Amhara versus ENDF civil war just a week ago, lead to Ethiopia becoming like Sudan? I don't know, man. I don't know. I've got to think that Abiy Ahmed being able to sort of beat the Tigrayans has probably added to his legitimacy in fairly significant ways. But I also know that the Amhara and the ENDF were allies in defeating the Tigrayans. So I haven't honestly looked in the Ethiopian politics in great detail. All right, folks. We've been doing this for 2 hours. I am getting tired. You can find me here on YouTube. You can find me on TikTok. You can find me on Twitter at RobOLaw. If you want to support the work we do here, which is pretty vital, we actually have like a good set of incentives for those who sign up as patrons now. We have a Discord server that is only available to patrons. It's just a really great resource. I've really, even more than usual over the past couple days, I've really enjoyed bouncing ideas off the very smart folks who are on the patrons only Discord server. We've got, the MENA list has been filled with great commentary and great discussion of what's happening in Sudan, and I think has really helped me come to a rather dark, but I think clearer position of the stakes and the importance of what's going on in Sudan than I've seen elsewhere. So I would highly recommend signing up on Patreon, getting access to that Discord server. We do a sort of Zoom chat, sort of a face-to-face chat with the patrons once a month. We did that. Was that? I guess that was last Sunday. Just this past Sunday, we had like 12 people there, it was a whole bunch of folks, but still a fun discussion. It's great to sort of hear the faces, see the voices of the patrons. We do that once a month. We also have coming up on Saturday the patrons only newscast, where I just sort of go through a list of news items from the month. So I basically prepare like 12 mini item discussions and can deal with every single one of the comments and questions on that patrons only newscast, and that'll be coming up this Saturday. Jeez, a lot of live chatting this week. So yeah, you should all sign up for that stuff. That'd be cool. All right. So yeah, thank you all very much for being here. Please do sign up on Patreon. And I am clearly losing coherence. And it's been 2 hours, so I think I will say thank you so much. Thank you for all the support. Thank you for being here. And let's all worry about Sudan a little more. Thanks so much. And good day.